Those who have no courage also know no shame. This is perfectly clear from the assortment of people who have taken a stand in indignation about Gaza without second guessing what Jeffin Corporation did in the 80s. Those who have no courage know no shame. Of course, they claim to be clever enough to have an alibi from which they hide them, from behind which they hide. Their alibi, of course, is what Penis Sinfield, one-time King Crimson operator for Celine Dion, called unviolence. UN violence, you might read that as. Penis J. Sinfield had a moronic idea about how to sell the cruelty and catastrophe of the AIDS onslaught in favor of Michael Reagan's defense of his dictatorial father, an authoritarian who I suspect and have evidence that goes to show not only was behind the script of Gail Burson or Texas School Book, but started his opening salvo of revenge for the Axis, a turnaround system from 46 to 64 in favor of the Axis by shooting JFK in Dealey Plaza, which is a phonetic combination of Death Valley, Dealey, D-E-A/L-E-Y. And he was, of course, the star of Death Valley Days. Penis J. Sinfield's idea was that he could calculate enough harassment, abuses, cruelties, betrayals, and backstabs to make what they called the tea kettle go off. There was a kid who used to do this to a piteous girl in elementary school named Elizabeth. His name was Billy Rod, and he would crook his finger at her, and she would say, "Stop that, stop that." And he'd call her a black sheep, and she'd say, "I'm not a black sheep, I'm not," and he'd lunge at him. And he said that this proves that if he could get the tea kettle to go off in this way, as a childish little game, he had disproven nonviolence as a political formula, and therefore the person he had tortured was not eligible for restitution or recognition from Amnesty International. And this is his rock star legal service to Reagan. It's important to understand that even in the terms that they tabulated on their abacus of juvenile activity, they never succeeded because there never was any kind of proof of and having never taken place. The +1 DAG they claimed took place during consensual sex, which they wanted to, Celine Dion wanted to construe as rape because the screamy Mimi cried for help. And this was against the blessings of the albatross of Kreskin's ESP holding his pick funny in King Crimson. And those who have no courage know no shame about this. This horrific Mengele, this Joseph Mengele from a Secret Service concentration camp, put together by media, because once that was in place, they could do anything to me, has me in the horrid condition of Section 8 with no friends, suffering from the dementia and depression of Parkinson's, which was scientifically assigned to me by these murderers. But those who have no courage have no shame. I don't expect to hear any remorse from these evil people. They will come and wax benevolent, like Nosferatu and a creepy Joe Biden. There's a scene in The Fountainhead, which is a good book. Yes, it's the good book by Ayn Rand. Well, Stephen Mallory says the most hideous thing you can imagine would be locked in a cage with a beast of prey or an insane inmate, and you say the most profound things, and it stirs at you with a cruelty and slavish, just drooling and intent all its own. That's what dealing with Peter Gabriel is like. He's a real fascist Mengele. And what these people do is talk in circles because they believe in fluxus. Their Crohag Reguster, Yoko Ono, is the imperial wizardress of their Ku Klux Klan, which now they call colors. It's part of a strategy they worked out with Putin. You know, back in the days when Russians were Christian, they believed in a safety net. That's why they were called communists. They were struggling with the same issues. That's why FDR was called a communist. Now they've thrown that overboard. They're all bourgeoisie with yachts now, red carpets and limousines, and Pink Floyd's autograph. So they talk in repetitions, which is fluxus, and it's easier to detect the fluxus repetitions that they use. Pushy has endless connotations down the echo chamber of Billy Rod crooking his finger at Elizabeth Penrose to watch the tea kettle go up. Because fluxus is easier to detect than the actual patterns at work, they use it as a camouflage for their crime scene. For example, one of the most savage aspects of this attack by the American conglomerate is that the people who you would think were capable of reason, Louis Lapham, for example, who wrote a fantastic essay about the war on drugs in December of 1989 for Harper's Magazine, was actually part of the sadistic crime of Gail Burslem. He actually went along with the plan to commit genocide. And you're supposed to reason with him when he is the drooling, fiendish beast of prey in whom you are locked into a room. And for example, he intoned what became of the president's census. This is an example of fluxus operations. I'll give you an example of actual patterns in a minute. The fluxus operations, what became of the president's census. Now, this was all in place, and it was far too sophisticated to have been innocent. It meant that he was working with Gail Burslem. When Sharon Samuels came out, who introduced me to Gail Burslem, and tinkled little bells at me and found out that I was deaf, we're making a reference to his White Rabbit, tinkling of little bells, in his book of essays, which includes the White Rabbit, about his friendship with the Beatles. So what they did was they created a bias framework. Obviously, it's a bias if you're Jewish and you go before Mengele. Mengele has the power and he hates Jews. So they structured it so that what has become of the president's census. One thing, I was a counterfeit dummy of presidential auspices. I came from the same status as W. I was from George Bush's ship in the Navy, from the San Jacinto as a little boy. My father had worked with Eisenhower at Teachers College and met with him at Teachers College while being from the same ship as Bush in the Navy. It was no accident that the murderous tormentors from the Zionist army who were in my neighborhood who tortured me and arranged the attack were working with someone named Edward Eisen and then a little English kid who was bitchy and nasty as can be. And they put together a billy club. That was one of the intonements of King Crimson's foul lyric sheet. Billy Rod, Billy Beck, and Billy Flynn, all of whom were faster than me. So you have this setup based on symbols and images. I was chosen for Jimmy C. There's another presidential characteristic because of Jimmy Carter. So my father was published in human rights, believed in the safety net. So he was against the fascist control of parasitism that the military industrial complex represents. And they had a hook that they were planning. But what they did was they set up a parable story that he staged as Elizabethan drama. Wattenmaker got me to stick my finger in a light socket, and I got an electric shock. And he showed me the Venus flytrap. So it's all in place to make this idea. Now, Toon, here's an example of the pattern. Toon, when meeting with Zelensky, said, as an aside, here's a man who's been through the most terrible things in history, the greatest terrible, terrible things in history. No man has endured more. He's obviously being sarcastic, and what they did was they got this hook in the queers. John Lennon's bias, motivated by Yoko Ono's revenge attack on me as a little boy from the World War II Army. In an environment where there's actually two sides to the issue of Lennon. One of them is that he died, and they were selling the idea that could have saved him but didn't know anything about it was a greater crime than plotting to kill him. Because Yoko Ono and Paul McCartney said they're on the same soccer team now as the people who killed him. And the money and the screen rights for Clint Eastwood are part of Reagan's friendship with King Crimson. So they put together this idea where motive and bias was perfectly clear. And there's another side, which is that John Lennon was behind this, that he had a Houdini going with Clint Eastwood and Reagan. And the difference between those two sides politically is that all of the power and all of the energy and all of the smoke and steam and mirrors is behind the idea, the lie that John Lennon died. Everybody is sworn to believe that. It's as holy as Obama's birth certificate. It's absolute truth. And then all of the evidence which shows that he pulled a Houdini, all of the evidence shows he pulled a Houdini. So it's power versus evidence. And they say, what became of the president's senses? Well, they pulled this kind of sneaky thing. Okay, so we see how dangerous these people are. And they come swooping down saying that they are benevolent. They're benevolent. And one of the patterns is the hook that they used. The hook that they used was to say that they were inflicting by betrayal by Rosa and Fripp and by torturing me with a nerve injury and giving me Parkinson's and having me backstabbed by everyone closest to me and threatening me with poisons, poisoning me in the mouth, bring my body temperature down to a consistent low, and making me deaf and locking me in dementia and depression of Parkinson's so the Mission Impossible tape self-destructs. It's a uniquely cruel spectacle. And they have people with HIV saying, aha, Freddie Mercury was a more uniquely cruel spectacle. And they played this hook long enough to get children, thousands of children buried alive under rubble. Talk about a uniquely cruel spectacle. And Yoko Ono comes croaking out with her crooked finger saying, you know, you're black sheep, I'm not a black sheep, I'm not. To see the tea kettle go off. Oh, whoopee-doo. What are you going to make something of it, Queerbone? Yeah. And this is what Robert Fripp sinister psychopathy amounts to. Lennon was nothing but the new Mengele. He presided over the extermination of the hopes of the post-war America. He saw to it with the help of his cocaine aggregator.